Morning, everybody. It's just about 9 o'clock, so I'm just going to go ahead and get us started today. In the chat box, I'm going to throw a quick link, which is the link for any parking lot questions or thoughts or concerns that you've had along the way. It could very well be related to this guidebook, likely it will be, but if not, feel free to email me, which I will put my here too. As well as Marcy. So I'm Nicole Medor. I'm the Early Childhood Specialist at the Department of Education. Marcy is our Early Childhood Monitor at the Department of Education as well. So Marcy has helped me prepare for today. However, she's unable to attend. So please, as usual, feel free to unmute or holler at me because I can't see your faces. So I will totally understand if you have to unmute and just call out my name to get me to stop at any point. I will not think it's rude in any way, shape, or form. In fact, I ask that you do that. Also, the chat box is available. I'll do my best to monitor that and sort of pause and go through to make sure anything that's applicable to today will be addressed. A few housekeeping items as usual. A link to the guidebook was provided via email. It's also available on our early childhood website, and it will pop up as a PDF like you see here. A 1-hour certificate will be available at the end of the meeting. If you're unavailable, or excuse me, if you're unable to access it through the link or the QR code that's provided, feel free to email me, and I'm happy to send that along after we're finished today. And there's no scheduled break, so please take care of any personal items at any time. So we're here today, July 7th. Our topic in the guidebook to discuss is preschool budgets. It starts on page 13. We've already covered these last 3 weeks worth of sections. They are recorded and housed on our professional learning and development page, which I can show you is here on our on our early learning page. On the bottom left-hand side is a tab, professional learning and resources. When you click there, you'll see an accordion unpacking the PreK Guidebook. And all of our sessions are recorded and housed right there. Our next 3 sessions will be family engagement, transitions, and technical assistance. So those will be coming up in the following weeks. So today's topic of preschool budgets does offer some subtopics. They're essential programs and services, lovingly known as the EPS formula. We have some financial items to consider when starting or expanding pre-K classrooms. We'll discuss briefly blending and braiding of funding, and then Title I-A funds that can be used. So today's it's pretty black and white in terms of the information provided in the guidebook around budgets. There's lots of ways that classrooms go above and beyond and are really innovative in how they house their classrooms and how they run their programs and how they partner with their community agencies and programs that are available to them. So the information today is not an end-all be-all, certainly just information to consider. So on page 13, PreK Budgets starts off with the EPS formula. And all this is meant to show is that any approved public pre-K program does receive funding through the EPS formula in the same way that our K-12 counterparts do. So if your school, your SAU is what we refer to as a high receiver, meaning the bulk of your budgeting for your K-12 program comes through the EPS formula, then once you add a pre-K classroom to that, it'll be included in the formula the same as the others. However, if you're a program that is what we call a low or non-receiver through the EPS formula, meaning most of your school's budget is provided through your local municipalities, and you don't receive a lot through the State Department of Ed through the formula, then unfortunately your pre-K program won't either, right? So the pre-K classroom follows suit with whatever you receive for your K-12. There's a lot of information online. I have the site down here at the bottom. It's our funding and our financial team that oversees the data and information on this site. Their contact information is available there as well. They're the best folks to ask any financial questions to. I'm happy to help the best way I can. But more often than not, when I receive questions about pre-K funding that's specific to the formula or specific to what you receive in your K-12 classrooms, I refer folks to them because they're best suited to handle any questions and clarifications around that. I will add, though, that in an effort to assure that these funds are made available to schools as soon as possible, we have somewhat of a timeline for that to happen. This timeline does not mean, it's not something that you have to follow. All it means is that if you want your funding for pre-K classrooms as soon as possible, then you have to follow this timeline. If your school, for whatever reason, can hold off a year or two before receiving funding for their program, then you have a little bit more flexibility. So typically in October, we send out a financial survey through the DOE newsroom. And really that survey is more for our finance team than it is for me. As helpful as it is for me, it lets our financial people know that you are intending on starting or expanding a program, meaning you're going to be serving 4-year-olds that you haven't served yet in the past. So that trick means to them that for budgeting purposes, they need to have an idea well ahead of time of what their budget is going to look like for their per student costs from the DOE's perspective. If you notify us, it's all well and good. If you don't notify us through this financial survey that goes out in October, and you start a program the following year, it's likely that you won't see your funding because those students were not budgeted appropriately. So like I said, it's not a make it or break it, but if you want your dollars, then you're best to let us know. Once you let us know in the month of October that your intention is to expand your programming, then a few months will go by and it will be spring of the following year. And that's when you'll notify me through the new or expanded survey of your intention to open. So this is all done almost a year before you even open your pre-K doors. This month of April is a little tricky, I know, with school boards and their approvals of adding classrooms and expanding programs. So I am flexible with folks around this. The date is there as sort of a reminder. Don't forget, this has to happen. However, if you just communicate with me and let me know any barriers or scheduling issues that you're facing, then I'm more than happy to work with you around that. This October deadline is much more important financially. And then that following September, you would begin your program and receive your money. So if you think about it in terms of a year, this October 2021, you would notify us of any intentions to start a program in September of 2022. Okay, so it's a little bit early. I'm just going to pause there for a moment. Oh, good, Heather, I answered your question. Good. And also, I will say this link at the bottom that takes you to the EPS formula, it's also where you can find what we call the ED 279. So that's a report of spending from schools. So you can see statewide spending, you can narrow it down by district, you can narrow it down by grade. So if you're in a position where you're making decisions around starting or expanding pre-K programming, then starting there with your district can give you sort of an idea of what you can expect to receive financially. So moving on, page 13, there's some financial items for consideration. And the list that's provided in the guidebook on this page 13 is pretty slim, but they're broad, I guess is what I want to say, not so much slim. But there is an appendix where we break it down much more so, which I'll show you in just a moment. So some things to keep in mind when you're building a budget. Certainly staff salaries, right? So you're going to want to make sure that whomever you hire to educate your 4-year-old has the appropriate certification, but then is also paid appropriately. So if they're your SAU staff, chances are they'll just be added to your school pay scale. And that's all well and good. If you have a partner, however, and the intention is that your partner is going to provide the teacher or the ed tech, then you're going to want to make sure that that individual is being paid appropriately, meaning just because they work for a local childcare doesn't mean they should get paid any more or less than your staff that you would pay through your school. Right? So we want to make sure that everything is all set in terms of morale and collegiality, and there's no he or she makes more or less than another person in the district. So have that on your mind when you're talking about hiring staff. Of course, space and materials. If you already have this available to you, fantastic. If it's something that you need to rent, if it's something you need to purchase, then that's going to come at an added cost. And as always, we'll want to think about quality and quantity. Certainly, you don't have to have the best made top materials for a classroom and furniture and whatnot. However, quality matters, quantity matters. If your intention is to have a classroom of 16 students, then you'll want to make sure there's ample space for tables, ample space for floors, ample space for materials, etc. Any renovations to space. Many of our schools in Maine are older buildings. Many are being renovated or torn down and rebuilt, which is lovely. However, if you don't have that available to you and you have a classroom that was built for older students, you may need to retrofit it for our 4-year-olds. They're physically smaller. They don't have the same physical abilities of reaching a sink or reaching a high toilet, etc. So some renovations to space may need to be considered. Not to make it or break it, just if the money's there and it's something that needs to be done, have it on your list. Of course, any curriculum materials or anything around professional development for fidelity to curriculum. Your outdoor space, we talk a lot about boundaries, supervision, and safety. So in chapter 124, it does talk about having offensive or natural boundaries. So a natural boundary could be very easily a tree line. Many of our schools have wide open fields for students to use to run, and that's fantastic. We don't want to fence students in. However, if there's a water source or a parking lot or a building right next door that doesn't have any boundary, it's something that you may need to consider in terms of student safety. And not as much as them exiting the outdoor space, but as having intruders enter the space, right? So it goes both ways. And then any fire code or compliance issues, this comes up a lot around partnerships as well, and any requirements that are needed in terms of students being on the first floor, fire exits, things like that. And then all of these will come up when you're designing your MOU. So I'll show you quickly where the appendix is. Bear with my scrolling. Sorry if this looks a little busy. So in the appendix, Appendix G, this is a very basic budget, just something that we've put together over the years from working with districts around building their programs from the ground up. So there's some basic preschool expenditures. And then at the bottom, there's a space for revenue. So if you know where your money is going to come from in terms of the EPS formula, any partners, Title I, your local revenue, etc. And then you simply subtract revenues from your expenditures to know exactly what your preschool will cost. Below that, in Appendix H, is a materials checklist. So this is just a list of materials that we know high quality classrooms possess. Remember, I was talking about quality and quantity, so that's all here. Again, not make it or break it items, but high quality pieces to add to any classroom. And I will say too that most, if not all of these, are what is needed if you're going to implement our PreK for Me curriculum. So it's broken out into blocks, manipulatives, and different centers. So these are things that you can check off as you already have or need to purchase. And then below that is a model table in a partnership. So this is just something that we threw together quickly to show things that you need to consider. And then who's responsible for it. So classroom space, who's providing the space? Maybe the SAU, maybe the partner. Who's providing the lead teacher? Maybe the SAU, maybe the partner, etc. And this is very generic. It can be manipulated in any way for better use by your program. Pause for just a minute. The most curriculum, I said I was going to pause, just kidding. Most curriculum does have required materials and furniture needed to implement it with fidelity. All of the ones for pre-K for me are listed on our site. It opens up into a Google Doc or an Excel, depending on what you're choosing. And then if you were to purchase a curriculum, which comes at its own cost, be sure to check out any required materials and furniture for that one as well. Can't do it to fidelity if you don't have the materials that it says you need. Pause for a moment. Another thing I'll say for this is, I've heard it before, so I know what happens. Our pre-K classrooms, let's see, how do I say this lovingly? Are sort of the new kindergarten class, right? So what we think of kindergarten spaces back in the 70s and 80s, that's what pre-K classrooms are starting to look like. Now, I would argue that kindergarten classrooms should still look that way, right? Should still have centers and materials and space for students to engage in interaction. So please don't get me wrong when I say that. However, I've heard before in meetings with administrators when we talk about materials and furniture for pre-K classrooms, and they'll say, oh, we have that in storage. We used to have that in our kindergarten classroom. We put that in the storage unit so many years ago. So if that's the case, or don't count that out as an option to go and get tables, chairs, whiteboard, whatever it is you might need for retrofitting a classroom, pre-K classroom. I remember one time an administrator told me that they had all kinds of wooden blocks up in storage, and I thought, get those out of storage, please, right away. Okay, other ways to fund your program. So we talked a lot last time about partnerships and collaboration. So this is a really great way, if you can't afford your classroom alone from your SAU, then a partnership or a collaboration is going to be your number one way of making that happen. So there's two things you can do, what we call braided funding and what we call blended funding. And either way will work. It just depends on what it is your district wants to entertain. So when you are braiding funding, that's when you're taking two or more entities and they agree to fund very specific parts of a program. So back in that appendix where I was showing you the list of who's responsible, that's an example of braided funding. So the SAU will pay for the staff, for example. The partner will pay for curriculum materials, for example, right? And that funding is given to the program and used specifically for that way. If at any time you needed to disaggregate it, you could, because it would be easily identified as this funding, this material, that material, okay? In a blended funding model, that's when those two entities just combine their dollars into one bucket and the program is supported through that bucket. So it's not about Head Start pays for this, SAU pays for this. It's Head Start's contributing X amount of money, SAU is contributing X amount of money. We combine it in a pot, and from there, it's used to fund the program. In my experience, more often than not, we see this example of braided funding. So it's when the two entities have two very specific roles financially. Blended funding is less likely, however, it's not out of the picture. It certainly could happen. This would be more apt to be visible in a philanthropic donation, for example, I think. So philanthropy happens all over the state, both locally and statewide. I know many programs receive donations for their schools all the time. And that is certainly true in pre-K as well. So sometimes it might be a financial donation in which that money gets put into a pot and then used to support the program in this blended funding model. Other times, philanthropic donations happen through materials or furniture or time, or through volunteers, things like that. So it's a very viable way to support your classroom, and it can certainly add to the overall quality as well. And then, of course, grant funding. So sometimes there are agencies within our state who offer funding. It's more spotted, but not impossible to reach out and say, hey, we're starting a program. We need some additional dollars to support PD and to write a small grant to receive that. There's also federal funding, which we've done in the past. I'm sure many of you are familiar with grant funding that we had back in 2015, where we expanded classrooms across the state. Our upcoming grant funding is through the ARP, the American Rescue Plan, which Maine has received, and Governor Mills has committed $10 million to the expansion of pre-K over the next couple of years. So this will be given out through a grant. There'll be a proposal. Actually, it's not going to be a proposal. It's not a request for proposals, but a request for applications. And so more information on that's coming out in the coming weeks. Our early learning team has already begun discussing what that request will look like and then how the money will be distributed. So there is a grant funding opportunity for expanded pre-K programs or new pre-K programs. The money will likely not be available for actual spending until school year 2022. Just for the sake of time, right? The school year 2021 is just a few weeks away. So to be able to expect that money to get turned out the door that quickly is just not reasonable. So we'll be able to take our time, be really strategic around what we're looking for and how and who gets some of that to expand their programs. I can tell you too that we're strongly encouraging partnerships through that, not an end-all be-all, but certainly something to consider if you're looking to access space for more students in your community. Just going to leave that there for a minute, see if there's any questions about that. Okay. And then the last part, before I ask some more specific questions of the group today, is a final way in the guidebook where it talks about ways to fund your program is through Title I dollars. So again, I am not the Title I expert at the department. We have one, but it is not me. And we worked closely with that team around this part, this section of the guidebook. So basically, for me, and what I wanted to share with you was it boiled down to the table that is available in the guidebook. And it just is looking at the two ways that schools receive Title I dollars. So some of times that's through a targeted approach, and other times a school receives Title I dollars on a school-wide basis. And the way in which you can use that money for pre-K is sort of highlighted through here. Basically saying that if you have pre-K students physically in your space and approved in your SAU, and you receive Title I dollars, then those pre-K students can be included in that budget. So if you're a targeted program, meaning students have to be identified through an identification process to receive Title I services, thereby using Title I dollars, then pre-K students are eligible for that as well. In a school-wide program, meaning all students qualify, there's no identification process. If your school is a school-wide Title I school, then your dollars are there and can be used. And pre-K students absolutely are eligible in that scenario as well. This can be a large misconception because pre-K is not compulsory, it's optional. So some schools think that because they choose to have a pre-K and they don't have to, that perhaps these Title I dollars aren't eligible for that classroom, but that's a misconception. They certainly are. And one thing I'll show you on the guidebook, bear with my scrolling, my apologies, is on the Title I page, which starts on 13 and rolls over to page 14. It does state that per federal regulations, Head Start eligible children, students who qualify as homeless and as foster children automatically qualify. So if you're in a partnership and you have students that meet these criteria, then you'll know that you can spend your money in that way as well. again, any and all Title I questions that come my way, I'm happy to help as I can, but I'm likely going to pull in our titles team to better support and assist schools around the use of this funding. I'll leave this here for just a moment in case you haven't had a chance to read it in the guidebook. I know another funding option for schools that many schools do not take advantage of just because of the sheer work involved in getting it is funding through main care dollars and for our special education services. So that's another one that's not listed here is CVS and how CVS can support pre-K programs as well. I know that they've worked this past year to open 12 new special purpose programs in many of our public schools. So that's another way to support students and families to provide an LRE for students in a regular ed setting or in a specially designed setting, depending on whatever the team determines the LRE to be. So we had sent out a survey, a pre-K expansion survey, to see what some of the barriers were for expanding programs and starting programs. And majority of the answers that came back were financially related. They couldn't afford, or it's difficult to afford the appropriate staff, or it's difficult to afford retrofitting space or renting space in a community, etc. So I just wanted to sort of open up conversation for us here today, for any brave souls that are interested in talking me through and helping me better understand financial barriers for pre-K, because certainly it's something that we want to support overcoming so that we can enhance our space and enhance our opportunities for our youngest learners throughout Maine. So I'm curious of what was discussed today and what is happening in your classrooms and your schools that you're aware of. What are some other ways to fund your program or other barriers that you're experiencing around funding your programs? I'm just going to open that up. Feel free to unmute or use the chat. So I'm just looking here in the chat around facilities. So in space, which is a huge, I agree, Heather, 100%. Certainly that's a barrier that schools have faced. So some creative ways to sort of overlook that. I know some schools that have very small spaces and they get hung up on the size of the program that they want to have. So for example, Chapter 124 talks about a ratio of 1 to 8 and a classroom cap of 16 students. That doesn't mean you couldn't have less, right? That doesn't mean that you couldn't have 8 students and 1 adult, or you couldn't have 12 students and an adult or 2, depending on how those 12 students come. So if you have, I know for a fact my home district here where I live, the pre-K classroom is in a much smaller square footage wise space. However, it accommodates the students who are present in that space. So just because the cap is 16 students, it doesn't mean that you have to fill your room of 16 students and have to have a room that would potentially fit 16 students. You could have less. With that said, I also know that sometimes even those spaces don't exist. So looking out, this is where partnerships and collaborations come into play. So I'd be curious to talk more about that or answer any questions around that. I know many schools will rent space in the community Sometimes there's a church, sometimes there's an old rec building or a space in a facility building that will be available for schools. Yeah, so PD is a huge one as well. I'm just reading from the chat box, Kelly's comment there around professional development for teachers, as well as, working within partnerships to support all students in inclusive classroom settings. So there's obviously professional development that you can purchase. There's ongoing coaching that you can purchase through outside entities that would come in and support that. But don't think twice about reaching out to our experts at the department as well. Whether or not we can provide the professional development is an option, but in addition, we might have other resources or other connections that could better support you and what you're trying to do in your space. Obviously, through the last year and this COVID year, things changed a lot, and we really amped up our communication with the field through professional development opportunities, or even just through open office hours, through phone calls, through Zoom calls, through emails, you name it. That was a big priority that came about because we just had the time and the space to do that. We didn't need to worry about traveling to schools. We could get on a Zoom call, end one call, and start another. So there was a lot of time available to us to better support teachers and administrators in the field. And I know my goal on our early learning team is to continue that. So as we move forward and sort of enter the space of regular classroom instruction again, or whatever that will look like in the coming year, we will still very much be available to provide and support any level of technical assistance or PD to folks. And you mentioned in your chat, Kelly, CDS, for example. So, CDS sits at our state office. So we interact regularly with our state level folks who oversee Part C and Part B services. And we'd be more than willing to work with them to better support the field around that. And yeah, Mary Beth, I thought of your program specifically when we were talking about philanthropic donations. So I don't know if you wanted to chat about what that looks like for you in your school. I can speak to it a little bit, but you live it. So if you're willing to add to that, that'd be great.
Let me turn my fan off.
Sure.
There. Sorry, I have a almost 16-year-old pug who needs her fan. So yeah, we were really fortunate to have we have a benefactor foundation called Redco in our community that actually came to the school and asked, "What do you need?" And the kindergarten teacher at the time talked to him about pre-K. And the unfortunate thing was the first time it went around, it went to public vote, the public said no to receiving. Essentially, it was a gift of $500,000 to pay for staff for 5 years. And they purchased I guess you call it a double wide, a modular that has 2 big classrooms, and paid for a chunk of furnishings. And we had enough money. We did the same kind of thing. We went through the attic, we went through the school, I went to Goodwill. I had run a preschool before at my home and had stuff, but we managed our money quite well. And then on top of that, we did get state subsidy. We have finished the 5-year program, and now it's the building we still have for another year. And the deal is that there's enough money for it this year, and it's going through the regular school budget. But next year, the school decides. If they don't want the building, he'll take it away. If they want the building, it's a gift. So I think the preschool's really proven itself that it's gonna continue. The first year we had 10 students. I had 6 in the morning, and I was by myself and I had 4 in the afternoon, and that was it. But my administration was great with it. They were just like, this is what we're going to try. The second year we had 29 students and we hired an ed tech. And we did 2 half-day programs. This year, we've done a lot of family surveys, and every year we do 2 surveys. This year we are going to full day, 4 days a week, and we have 16 already, and we have 6 on a waiting list. We serve 5 communities, so it's not just from our town. And I'm trying to think what else. Yeah, so Fridays, we have called them our family Fridays. And last year was really sad because we didn't get to do very much. We did at the very end of the year have, in May, we were able to have little appointments so families could come in with their child. It was kind of like an open house. We had art up and they each got about a half an hour. And that was really nice. It was a lot of work. It took 2 Fridays, but typically Fridays are planning, prep, and we've done field trips. We use the teaching strategies, curriculum, and we do a lot of I really like their celebrations of learning. So if we've done a big unit on, trees, then parents get to come in and see all we've learned about trees. And we've had a potluck at night to accommodate folks that can't come during the day. And we've had a pizza. I think our best attended or most positive feedback was the simplest thing we did. We had a pizza party. We ordered pizzas. We had veggie sticks and ice water and fruit. And we had all the centers set up and everybody played. And people just said how relaxing it was and they got a real feel. So yeah, it's been a really successful program. We also, although this may change this year because it's a tremendous amount of work, but we do a fundraiser every spring. And this year we made $1,300 selling plants that mostly I started and some donations, but that is our money. So if we want to buy, last year we bought 2 mud kitchens and some outdoor wagons. There's nobody, we don't have to fill out a form, whatever. And I also throw the word out all the time to parents, and I'm sure everybody does, like if you're cleaning out your pantry, we'll take cream of tartar and flour and food coloring. And I put boxes up at the main, we're separate from the main building. So I put boxes up for scrap paper, and they know I'm not quite picking the dumpster, but almost.
It's beautiful junk, we call it.
Yeah. So we're very fortunate.
Yeah, that's it. Your district is a really great example of how a donation was given and provided at the beginning, but yet you worked to sustain it. So that's a really big goal. It comes up a lot for us in discussion around grant funding. We want the money to go to the schools. We want it to go and to support the children. However, we don't want it to be a cliff at the end, right? We're not going to give you all this money for it to work for a couple of years just to find out that the district or the partnership can't sustain the program ongoing. So that's always a huge part of the conversation when we have the opportunity, and not just us at the DOE, but when SAUs have the opportunity to receive money through a grant or through a donation, to be really thoughtful around where you're going to put those dollars, how it's going to support your program, and when those dollars are gone, how your program is still going to sustain itself in a high quality way. So, speaking for us, when we're talking about providing grant funding and support for schools, that's always going to be part of the conversation. Yes, we will give this to you. How are you going to sustain it when the money's gone, so that you don't fall off that cliff? And then I know, and recently the governor signed the budget, which increased the state funding to 55%. So that's still an ongoing conversation as well. I personally need to better understand what that will look like for schools across the district. Quite honestly, your financial offices within your own SAUs probably have a better handle on what that will look like for your districts, and what that could look like for pre-K in the long run. But that was another exciting opportunity too. I think that can really boost programming in our public schools. I'm just going to switch over to this slide so that folks know if you have a question. This link just brings us to the parking lot, which I was showing earlier. I'll check there real quick. And then the only other thing I guess I would add for today is Marcy had mentioned earlier around us developing a partnership technical assistance series. So we are continuing to work on that. We hope to provide it in the beginning weeks of August. So the dates and the folks and the topics are still being finalized, but certainly funding and how to partner in a financial way will be discussed during that series. So when it's time to register or more information is finalized, then that'll go out through the newsroom. I'll offer this here as well. Folks are welcome. I don't have any other new information to share. I'm happy to stay on and chat more about pre-K budgeting and funding for programs. However, it's a beautiful day and it's a holiday week, so I'm not going to keep you a minute longer than you want to. I can throw this link into the chat box as well, and this will take you straight to your certificate.